So this is part 2 of my Brotherhood Sword tutorial. If you'd like to see part 1, I'll leave a link in the video description box below. In that one, I just show you how to make the plug for the mold, which is the black sword. And then in this one, I'm going to show you how to make the mold, cast the sword, and then add the finishing details. Okay, so starting off, get yourself some oil-based clay. I use this brand right here. And I know, I skipped a good chunk of me covering this thing in clay. But for an object this big, it's a long, tedious process, and I just figured I'd spare you guys tears of boredom. Now, obviously I have to explain a few things. Like, make sure you have a base to put the clay and the object on. I used cardboard, but a lot of people used foam core because that's what a lot of people use for the walls of a mold. But I didn't have a lot of foam core at the time, so I just used scraps of cardboard and taped it together. Also, when you do this step, don't skimp out on the clay. I bought 3 5-pound bags of clay. I should have bought at least 4, but probably 5. But I didn't want to spend more money at the time, so I made it work, but then I made things more difficult on myself. So I saved money on clay, but later ended up having to spend even more money on silicone. And I'll try to explain my mistake here in this little illustration. So imagine this here is the sword, and it's laying face down on a surface. And then this here is the clay, stacked up evenly, dividing the center of the sword, as it should be. And then here we have the silicone, which is going to fill up evenly because our clay is leveled. This, however, is not what I ended up doing because I didn't want to buy more clay. So what I did was I laid the sword at an angle like this, and then I built up the clay around that. So now I can fill the mold with silicone, but my problem is this area here. This area now needs a lot more silicone just so I can cover the rest of the sword. So from here to here, I ended up kind of making this weird sort of steps out of the silicone, which required me to let the first layer of silicone cure, and then I was able to build like small little boxes to fill the areas that needed more silicone. And I just wanted to say, please don't try and make a mold the way I showed you in that illustration. It's just to show you guys what not to do. I did it because I've never made a mold of this magnitude before, so I was just trying to cut corners everywhere I could. It turns out that's not the best idea, so I just made life harder on myself. So the illustration was there just to show you what I did wrong and to make sure you don't make the same mistake. Also, if you're wondering what I'm doing, I'm just cleaning up the edges of the clay a bit and the surface of the clay, just so we can get ready to build those foam core walls and to add the registrations. So as you'll notice here, I already started gluing some of the foam core board down. If you notice that they're different colors, most of them are just scraps from old school projects. Also, I didn't have any pieces of the foam core long enough to go around the entire edge of the mold. So I had to tape and glue pieces together, and the duct tape didn't really work all that well, so I ended up reinforcing that seam that I glued together with just another piece of foam core, and that actually worked really well. And now we can just start gluing things with regular old hot glue. I'm sure you also noticed that I already added the registrations. Just ignore those because I end up fixing them after I glue all the walls on, because you may end up smushing the clay a bit when gluing on the walls and then ruining the registrations. Kinda like what happened to me. Now, on to the registrations. You can use almost anything you want to make registrations in your clay. I happen to use my X-Acto knives because I have 2 with 2 different size handles, and you don't need to do 2 different sizes. That's just what I chose to do. And one thing I didn't show because I forgot is make sure you get the end of the object that you're using to make the registrations. Make sure to dip it in some water because that will help the clay release the object a lot easier. So now we can finally start mixing up the silicone. I will say this was the most expensive part of the project. However, once I actually finished the sword, I found a very helpful tutorial by Adam Savage, which actually helps to cut back on the amount of silicone you use. Basically, you do a few coats of silicone and then cover the rest in plaster. So next time I need to make a mold of something this big, I will definitely try that method. Okay, so clearly I didn't mix up enough silicone to fill this up. but I also didn't have a mixing bucket big enough to hold it all. So it's really not a huge deal to do this in batches if you need to, because like I kind of mentioned before, I myself had to do this in batches because I didn't have enough money to buy the amount of silicone I needed all at once. And then here's what it looks like after I used up all the silicone from my first purchase. Obviously I have to buy more, but I ended up using the brush technique, which really helps to make sure that the silicone makes it into all the nooks and crannies of your project. So here's the first half of my mold complete. Take note of those cardboard walls I was talking about earlier in my illustration? Yeah. Please don't be too harsh or judgmental. I know this mold is far from perfect, but you'll learn from your mistakes and you'll move on. And if you guys have learned anything from my tutorials, it's what not to do. Though, if you would like to see a proper mold making tutorial, I suggest that you go check out Adam Savage's YouTube. One of the first videos I ever watched about silicone molds was on his channel, and they were actually casting a lightsaber hilt. So I'll make sure to link that in the description below. And then all I'm doing here is tearing apart the box. Pretty self-explanatory, I think. And now I'm removing the clay. Just ignore the PVC pipe. I used that under the clay to make it go further. So now that all the clay's been removed, we can start adding our clear coat. I use this brand, but really doesn't matter what brand you use, any clear coat will do. Now, I didn't film this part, but you want to make sure you spray your clear coat all over the surface of your silicone. What the clear coat does once it's dry is create a film that just sits on top of the silicone. This will help prevent the two halves of silicone from sticking to each other because the only thing silicone sticks to is itself. Now I went ahead and did the second half of my mold, and now we can just start tearing the box apart. Though you might want an X-Acto knife on hand because it's really useful for cleaning up any edges and then cutting into any areas of the silicone that might be kind of difficult to just rip apart. And if you do have trouble pulling the silicone apart, don't panic. I myself had some difficulty here and I felt like my heart stopped beating for a minute there, but I did eventually get it. As long as you manage to spray enough of the clear coat on the whole surface of the silicone, I promise it will eventually pull apart. So now we can start mixing up some resin. Just ignore this stuff. All it is dried up leftover resin from my first batch. And then here's the brand of epoxy I'm using. It's a 2-part resin with a 1:1 ratio, so that's nice. And then here we have part B. As for coloring the resin, we'll just be using good old food coloring. I happen to be using the Wilton brand in their neon and primary color packs. For my resin to color ratio, I use 4 drops of blue and 3 drops of teal per liter, but honestly, if I were to do it over again, I might add a tiny bit less. As for the glitter, I'm using an ultra fine light blue glitter by Kraft. And then we have extra fine glitter in lime gold. And as for this lavender one, it was a random sample pack I got with my order, so I decided to add it to the resin mixture, because why not? I should also mention that we are only adding really fine bits of glitter to this part, because if you use anything much bigger than that, it'll sink, and you'll only have glitter on one side of the sword, and that wouldn't be pretty. So now we can start pouring our resin in. As you can see, this isn't going to fill the mold, but that's because we need to do the resin in layers, at least at first. So for the bigger pieces of glitter, well, this one is actually 10mm size circular sequins. I just used a little bit because it looks kind of like bubbles. And then some large opalescent circular glitter, a tiny bit of medium silver hexagon shaped glitter, and then just because I had it, I used some iridescent Kraft Glitter by Spectra. So I don't know if you can tell, but I already sprinkled the glitter on here. So now we can pour a thin layer of resin on top and let it cure so that the glitter stays put. I've actually done this process 3 times for each sword half, so 6 times altogether, but you could probably do it in 4. And now we just wait for it to cure, and then we can put the 2 halves of the mold together. Now I'm just gonna say the sword will fall away from the edges of the mold, but trust me, it works out. So I know a lot of people tend to use foam core to clamp their molds together, but with such a big mold I had to use wooden planks instead. There was just no way foam core was gonna hold this together. Thankfully we had some wooden boards just sitting in our garage, so I was able to cut that to the shape I needed. And if you're new to mold making, the purpose for this is 1, to keep the mold rigid because silicone likes to flop around, and 2 is because when you clamp it together, it will distribute the pressure evenly. Also, this here was my ridiculous way of evening out the back side of the mold so that I had a flat surface to work with. I pretty much ended up using any sort of scraps I could find and then glued it to one of the wooden planks so I could try to even out this mess of a mold I made. I know it's not perfect, but at least it works. Now mix up some more resin and then pour it in. Try to go slow here, otherwise you'll end up spilling, like I did. Also, I should mention that from here on, when we mix up our resin, we're only using the really fine glitter I talked about from earlier. And just a little side note, a lot of people use rubber bands to keep their molds together rather than clamps. However, with such a large mold, you absolutely have to use clamps. Otherwise, the resin's gonna leak. So now that the resin is completely cured, we can start taking the mold apart. Keep in mind this resin does take 24 hours to cure. And here it is. After all my mistakes, I almost can't believe how pretty it turned out.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
Now, to remove this little nub thing, I grabbed my Dremel and used my saw blade attachment. And now we can sand down any rough surfaces or imperfections, one of which would be where we sawed the little nub thing off, and others being caused by the fact that we had to pour resin in layers first before we could clamp the mold together. So after sanding it down, you'll notice that the surface now looks cloudy and scratched up. To fix this, simply add a coat of resin. Only downside is you'll have to wait another 24 hours before moving on to the next step. So for this part here, I'm using my airbrush, but you should be able to still get similar results without one. Also, the paint I have here is a transparent airbrush paint by Jacquard, so I'll be using the colors blue and white. Though if you don't have any transparent colors, you can always just thin down whatever paint you have. So for this part, I wanted the paint to be a little more opaque around the edges of the bubbles, so I removed the paint from the center with some rubbing alcohol, and then added another light coat of paint. And this part is totally optional, but I used what white paint I had left on the points of the sword. And now I'm just building up the white around the edges with some regular acrylic paint, which I thinned down a little. And here I added some of the transparent blue, which I ended up thinning down, and then I just apply it near the hilt for a slightly deeper color, and then over the bubbles to make the white less intense. And now I'm just mixing a little bit of transparent green with the blue, and then pretty much repeating the same process I did with the white paint. And if you're wondering what I'm doing with the paper towel, I'm not removing the paint, I'm just kind of dabbing away the excess. So for this main section here, I'm just using a primary blue as the base, you know, on top of the white base, which black would have been better, but whatever. And now I'm just using an old hairdryer to speed up things, because you need to do at least 2 coats of blue. Also, I know I could have used my airbrush for this, but I didn't feel like covering everything up in masking tape just to prevent paint from getting everywhere I didn't want it, so in this case, I preferred painting everything by hand. Now I wanted the blue part of the sword to have a sort of iridescent look, so I bought some pearlescent pigment powders by Color Effects, one of which being Cabana Blue, and then I mixed that with some glossy varnish. However, I did already paint that coat on, and it was just a smidge more blue than I wanted, so I took a turquoise sort of color, which in this case is called Aqua Blue, and mixed it with a color shifting pigment called Aquamarine, which actually gives it the more aqua color I wanted, and because it's a color shifting pigment, you should be able to see some purples and greens in there. Now, for this part here you'll need a 3mm size cord, boiled water, and tweezers. So the cord I'm using is a 3-strand cotton twist. Now unless you can find a rope or cord in the right shade of green, I suggest you make sure your cord is cotton or some sort of natural fiber because we're going to be dyeing this and synthetic fiber is more difficult to dye. And here I'm using Rit dye in the shade dark green. And I'm just kind of eyeballing the amount, you really don't need much for something so small. And then just let that sit for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then once that's done, we can take it out and rinse it off in some warm water. and then once more with cold water just to make sure you've gotten all the excess color out. Now squeeze out as much water as you can, and then set that aside to dry. Now for the hilt, I used some cotton handlebar tape, which is 3/4 of an inch wide. Handlebar tape is nice because it has an adhesive backing, so it's literally tape, unlike twill tape. Now make a mark on both pieces of tape, which will be the circumference of your hilt. Now these next steps are kind of hard to explain, so hopefully you can understand what I'm doing just by watching, but if not, try searching for a Harlequin bar tape tutorial. I myself had to watch and read a few tutorials before I completely understood what I had to do. Side note, I did have to continuously flip the sword so I could make sure the pattern looked like diamonds on both sides of the hilt, because if you don't, there's a very good chance it'll look perfect on one side and not the other. Now add some superglue to make sure it stays in place. Now for the cap of the hilt, I just used Epoxy sculpt. I'm sure there's other things you could use, but this is what I had on hand, so I figured I'd use it. Also, if you use black epoxy sculpt like me, you may want to put plastic wrap around the hilt because the black gets all over your hands, and if you're not careful, it'll get on the tape that we just wrapped the hilt in. Now for this step, I'm just sanding the details of the cap. I'll be using this diamond point tip with my Dremel. You could also skip this sanding step if you just remember to carve the little groove details in before the epoxy sculpt cures. Now just sand the surface a bit more if needed, and then you'll want to drill a hole in the top of the hilt that's big enough to fit the eye bolt. If you're at all curious, the eye bolt I used has an inner diameter of 3/4 of an inch. The thickness of the bolt has a diameter of 5/16 of an inch, and the length of the bolt is 4 inches long, though that really doesn't matter because I shorten it with bolt cutters anyway, just so I don't have to drill into the hilt as much. And now we can glue the eye bolt in. Now you could just use super glue, but for this step I personally preferred using total glue. It's basically an epoxy that cures in like 5 seconds, so I really like this stuff. Now for the little spearhead things, just make yourself a stencil in a long sort of diamond shape and cut out 4 pieces onto some EVA foam. Now apply some contact cement to all 4 pieces and set those aside to get tacky while we cut out 2 more diamond shapes, however this time on some PETG. Then apply glue to that and sandwich it in between the EVA foam. Now just sand it down to a sort of spearhead shape. Also, notice how nice of a point the foam comes to? That's because of the PETG. If we didn't have that, you wouldn't get a very sharp point. So you may notice that the spearheads are already painted and glued to the rope. We'll just forget that because I realized I could make these look way better. So I guess I should mention that I used epoxy sculpt for the top of the spearheads, which in this case having the rope there was helpful because it gave the clay something to hold on to, but it's not necessary. But anyway, once that's done, grab your case of assorted O-rings and pick 2 different sizes. You could probably get away with just using one size, but because of the cone shape on top of the spear, I figured 2 different sizes would be best. And if you've ever done any sort of electrical wiring, you'll probably have some heat shrink tubing on hand. If not, then you'll want to get some, but preferably an assorted case so you can determine which size fits your spearheads best. Now give this part a black base and just glue the spearhead to the cord. And now just heat up your heat shrink tubing. You can use a heat gun or a hairdryer for this step, but I like using a lighter because it's more precise. Now I'm just painting the spearheads to make them look more weathered, which I do by covering it in a charcoal sort of color and then brush away the excess. Then I do a similar thing for the highlighted areas, but in this case it's a light gray. Then I just add yellow to the O-rings, and then some blue to the heat shrink tubing, even though it's already blue. Now our hem is going to be 1 inch wide, so make a mark 1 inch up from the red fabric. This will be our stitching line. Also, just ignore the fact that I didn't match the edge of the yellow fabric with the edge of the red fabric. I took into consideration the seam allowance, which in this case I chose 1/2 inch, but just ignore that because it's just more work and then you end up trimming away the excess fabric anyway. So just match the edges up like this and sew 1 inch up from the edge. Then once you're done sewing that, flip the yellow fabric over to the other side, give it a press with your iron, and then make another mark 1 inch up from the edge of your fabric. And then once you're done with that, make sure to trim above your marking so that you still have a seam allowance. Now press the raw edge to the inside and make sure the fabric covers that stitching line. Now stitch that down, and if you did it right, you should have one single top stitch on either side of the yellow fabric. And then once both hems are finished, we can start sewing the sides. The sewing technique I'm actually using for this part is called a narrow hem. And I found it difficult to explain this step without going into too much detail, so if you don't know this technique and you're interested, try searching for a narrow hem tutorial. And then this part's totally optional, but I personally didn't like how vibrant the yellow was, and I wasn't gonna bother buying more dye just to darken the color, so I took some acrylic paint in a dark brown and goldish color, and then thinned them down with some water and mixed them together. And then once the paint's dry, we can then tie the cloth onto our eye bolt. I'm doing some kind of slip knot, though I don't really know what kind because apparently there are a bunch of different types, so hopefully you can gather what I'm doing just by watching, because I wasn't really sure how to explain it. And that's the end of my tutorial. Sorry it took me so long to upload, but I really hope you guys enjoyed it. I am planning on posting more tutorials in the future, so if you're interested, please subscribe and maybe hit that like button as well. And if you'd like to see some pictures of the sword or some of my other work, I'll have a link to my website in the video description below, and I guess I'll see you guys next time. Toodles!